Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manus Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're returning back to a topic that we've spoken about time and time again, the sort of Cold War II between the United States and China. Some might say we've met somewhat of a breakthrough as a meeting occurred between President Biden and Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Meeting in San Francisco last week. Brunello, you've been following this meeting quite closely. Could you give us a bird's eye view of what happened here?
Yes, this meeting is something we have anticipated a few times in our columns and podcasts, because we always known that it was absolutely crucial that Xi Jinping and Biden would meet face to face to discuss the most pressing issues on the global economy. Finally, and thankfully, this meeting took place. And first of all, it's good news this happened, because you remember how in a number of occasions previous meetings have been cancelled, especially when Blinken tried to go to the US Secretary of State, tried to go to China. But then there was this scandal, so to speak, of the Chinese spy balloon, and therefore he had to cancel the trip. So the fact that the meeting took place was already, I would say, good enough. High on the agenda was for Biden to reestablish the military-to-military cooperation between the two countries that were suspended after Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan in August 2022. In previous occasions, China refused to reopen those lines of communications, and this has caused several incidents in the Taiwanese Strait. But finally, it seems like Biden succeeded and managed to convince Xi to reopen the military-to-military cooperations. Then there were other meetings on climate change ahead of the COP28 conference in Dubai later this month, or a joint effort on stopping fentanyl trafficking, this drug that is causing a sort of opioid epidemic in the US. These were much more vague than the one that I mentioned before, but at least that goal was achieved.
Fantastic. So it seems like there were some positive developments, but at the same time, the real sort of thorn in the US-Chinese relationship has been the issue of Taiwan, which is a multidimensional issue. It's a security issue, a political one, now an economic one with the amount of semiconductor chips that it manufactures. How did these two leaders speak about Taiwan? To what degree will this be, how will this factor into the relationship in the coming months?
So, as I said, it's a good thing that this meeting took place and these decisions were made. But on the one hand, these decisions were almost inevitable, since we had so many incidents in the Strait of Taiwan that without further agreements, of course, the risk was that eventually some serious incident would occur. So it's understanding the posturing between countries, but then, reality needs to take over at some point. The other thing is that Taiwan will be at the center of attention in the next few weeks, because in early January, there will be the presidential elections there. And we have discussed how there's a window of opportunity for China to try to destabilize the country between those general elections and the elections of the US, when the reaction function of the US president, by definition, is constrained. And therefore, I would say this is something that needs to be watched very closely. Another thing that didn't go exactly as possibly Blinken would have wanted is an easing of the verbal tensions between the leaders. When specifically asked, Biden reiterated that, according to him, Xi is a dictator. And clearly, this is not something that any person, even dictators, want to be called somehow So to some extent, is something that remains in evolution and needs to be clarified down the line. Finally, the commitment on climate change is very vague. There's no mechanism of enforcement, so there's still a lot of work to do to improve the bilateral relationship between these two countries.
Gotcha. There's also the sort of Chinese putting more pressure on Russia and its involvement in the war in Ukraine, which is continues to be an issue as the war goes on, although media attention is now perhaps on other conflicts around the world. How does that factor in into any of this?
It's another of the points on the list that didn't get checked. Clearly, Biden would have wanted Xi Jinping to finally put some pressure on Russia at a time in which President Putin is saying, "Oh, we need to put an end to this tragedy that is happening in the Ukraine." And Prime Minister Meloni and Chancellor Scholz jointly said, they met last week, jointly said, well, just withdraw from Ukraine. You'll see how this tragedy will end immediately. But this is not going to happen until she clearly tells Putin that this needs to be the case. Instead, she has actually promoted an expansion of BRICS, making it a geopolitical rival to the G7 by including Iran and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Argentina. So the basis for what we have called in the past Cold War II remains in full swing. And then there's this aspect that we believe is somehow more worrying than everything else we've just said. When asked, Xi Jinping said, look, the world is big enough for both countries to succeed. Now, this seems to be a sentence that tries to ease tension, but in reality, it suggests that the world can be, in fact, divided between the two countries. It's like saying, you grow on your half, I grow on my half. Half of the world for each is big enough. But the problem is that these two halves are not going to speak. There's not going to be communication. There's going to be continued tensions. So to some extent, it reads like the world is big enough, but as this movie by James Bond 007 was titled, is the world is not enough. It's kind of the opposite to some extent. So, and the idea that the world can be polarized between spheres and divided between spheres of influence as a peaceful way of progressing is just delusional. We have seen during Cold War I how it ended. Constant conflict between the two countries, proxy war around the globe, risk of nuclear Armageddon at every corner, and only because then there was a clear victor, the US, that Cold War I ended. But in this case, the race is going to be much longer and harder than before, and it's not clear who's going to win it. So cooperation is the peaceful way forward. Any other solution will just increase tensions over time.
Yeah. And that sort of betrays the reality that many of the countries in the global south actually don't want to choose, don't want to choose in this sort of dichotomous bipolar world. Countries like India, the most populous country in the world, certainly in the global south, wants to lead its own third way. So that's certainly a dynamic that we'll watch in not only the months, but the years to come. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.